Hello, once again, this is Marsha Criollo. Today's topic is going to be about the raw material in steel, and it's also the mining process. So let's begin. Okay, now we're going to talk about some facts about steel and its history. So steel is light in proportion and to its strength. It is very suitable for rapid construction and it is also inexpensive. Some history will be that at the beginning of the 19th century, metal did not yet become an important role into building construction, but instead was used into connecting devices. Also, in 1850, steel was very expensive. However, after 1850, it became inexpensive due to the introduction of Brazier process, which led for more steel to be produced in only 20 minutes. This increased the steel production, decreasing the costs. Moving on, let's talk about the material of steel. So steel is an ion of iron. Some properties could be some properties we know is the ordinary structural steel, also called as the mine steel, which contains 3%, contains like less than 3/10 of 1% of carbon. Also, we have another one known as the ordinary cast irons, which contains about 3 to 4% of carbon, and is greater in quantities of impurity than steel. The raw materials used in steel making is iron ore, coal, limestone, and recycled steel. Some important information on the carbon content is that if carbon is added too much, the metal will be hard and bitter. However, if there is little amount of carbon, it will produce a very weak material, like the warrant iron, which contains less carbon than most of the steel islands that we have. So, as already mentioned, carbon content is very crucial to the properties of iron metals. Moving on, let's talk about the first raw material, which is the iron ore. So, steel is an alloy consisting mostly of iron. It is which contains less than 2% of carbon. Iron core is very essential to the production of steel, in which 98% of its mined iron is used for the production of steel. Also, its oxidized or core make about 5% of the Earth's crust. And some facts about iron mining will be that iron is mined in about 50 states, where most is done in Brazil, Australia, the US, Russia, and China. Also, some like fun fact would be that Australia and Brazil both dominate the world's iron exports. Moving on, let's talk about the another important raw material, which is cooling coal. So this is very also important into the steel production because this core is used to reduce the iron oxidized in the Earth's crust. It is basically its primary function is as a reducing agent of iron ore. It and then some of its important fact is that about 1 million tons of core is used in steel production. So that's a very large amount of material that's being used in steel production and and mining. Another important raw material would be limestone. So limestone is very important. So limestone is a rock that contains 5% of calcium carbon trioxide. Limestone also is used in iron and steel industry as a flexing material. And it is basically added to the iron ore before it enters the blast furnace. The limestone reacts as an acid impurity called slag and floats on top of the maiden iron, where it then slims off. So later on, I have a small image in which I will show you how that works and how like limestone is added before it enters the vessel furnace. Moving on, let's talk about another important, not this is not a raw material, but it's a material that's commonly used in steel production, which is basically the recycled steel. So due to its lightweight potential and its durability, steel products can be reused and recycled to produce more steel. So steel is also very easy to separate from waste rates. Therefore, there's a high recovery rate, which also avoids landfills. And Adding up, some steel productions contain about 100% of recycling contents of steel, in which is very beneficial to the environment because it saves energy and raw materials like iron, coal, and limestone, which do take a lot of quantities to make iron and steel. So also 95% or more of our structural steels used in North America are recycled and reusable, which therefore saves energy, as I already mentioned, and also the raw material saves raw materials, which is very good and beneficial for the environment. Moving on, let's talk about the process that it takes to go from iron to steel. Okay, so the process of converting iron into steel begins with the smelting of iron into cast iron. Cast iron is produced in a blaze furnace charged with alternating layers of iron core, iron ore, coal, and crushed limestone. The coke is then burned by large quantities by air forces into the bottom of the furnace to reduce the carbon monoxide. This later reacts with the ore to reduce its element to the element iron. Limestone forms a slag with various impurities that are later poured into the iron. The maiden iron is then taken off at the bottom of the furnace and held as a liquid state to process into steel. So I already told you this would be the image and what I told you about how this process works. The last process would be how we introduce the iron ore, the limestone, and the coke through here, which later on flows inside this material. And after that, it's being heated up, and we later on get the iron liquid, which is later used for the steel. Moving on, we could talk also about the basic oxygen process, which is also another, which is basically a very common method into converting iron to steel. So this process is in which a hollow water-cooled lens is lowered into a container of maiden iron and recycled steel strapped. After this is done, a steam of pure oxygen at high temperature is blown to burn off the excessive carbon and impurities. After this, lime is added to the metal to react with other impurities to form a slag that is later discharged. Also, new elements can be added to the container at the end of the process to adjust the compression of the steels to its desirable strength or to the desirable place. It also takes about an hour from the starting point to the finishing point of steel production. This would be the process of the oxygen process, in which is basically poured into a container. We have the maiden iron already over here, and we also have the opening section for the oxygen that reacts with the gas phase in order to produce this. And we have an image of this in an Ohio steel mine. It's very similar, which you see over here. The container is being poured. Moving on, let's talk about the mining process in the structure mine. So in the structural mine, beam blanks are reheated and then passes through a succession of rollers. These rollers squeezes the material into its desirable shape and size. Once its desirable shape and size is being done, it then exits from the last sets of rollers as a continuous length. The links are then cut into shorter segments by a hot sauce. These elements are then cooled on a cooling bed. After this, the roller straighteners then fix any crookedness in these small segments. Finally, each piece is then cut into its length and it's labeled with its shape and the number of batches of steel in which it was rolled. After that, it is basically shipped out and it is certified, saying that the steel productions follow the standards. So now we can also talk about the rollers in the structure mine. So rollers spacings could be changed during this mining. This helps make different shapes with the same dimension, the same numeric dimension. That's why this is very functional for the architects or for the engineers, because this gives them a variety of steels, shapes, and sizes that they could use and determine for specific structures, specific elements into the construction. For example, the Y flint shapes are basically more used for the beams and the columns, which because they're strong, and they're strong, and therefore we need them to be in the beams and columns. This will be the end of my video, in which I talked about the raw materials in the steel and the way it's being processed, and also about the method in which was the oxygen process method, in which basically everything's located into the container, and and how iron is basically, and how steel is basically done after all these elements are introduced into the system. We also showed you the image of the container and another big image. And that will be end of the video. I hope you learn more about the steel, its raw materials I already explained, and how nowadays we're now also using more of this recyclable steel to keep producing more steel, because it also reduces the amount of raw materials we use, for example, like the limestone, the coal, and the iron, which is very beneficial, and you're also saving up more money and more money. And as you already know, steel is lost in cost. And yeah, so thank you for watching and have a nice day.